The Tribunal's Judgment. The tribunal chamber of the Krexar Empire stood cold and imposing, its obsidian walls reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights that cast eerie shadows across the floor. 5 alien judges sat elevated on their bench, their reptilian features unmistakable, scales that gleamed like polished metal, eyes that blinked sideways, and necks that stretched unnaturally long as they peered down at their prisoner. Before them stood 8-year-old Alara Vance, her small frame dwarfed by the massive chamber. Heavy shackles bound her wrists and ankles, the metal chains far too large for her delicate limbs. Her once white tunic, woven from synthetic cloth, was now stained and torn from weeks of captivity. Yet despite everything, her eyes held no tears. She had not wept once since her capture from the transport ship that had carried her family through Krexar space. High Inquisitor Varek rose from his seat, his vocal cords vibrating with an insect-like buzz as he spoke. Alara Vance of Earth, his words echoed through the chamber, you stand accused of crimes against the Krexar Dominion. The charges were whispered throughout the court, some claimed she had single-handedly caused a blackout on their most advanced warship, walking through its systems like a ghost and leaving it powerless in space. Others insisted she had somehow communicated with their artificial intelligence, making it forget its programming and turn against its masters. The most incredible rumor spoke of how she had tamed a Vorax lizard in the slave quarters, turning a creature bred for pure aggression into her devoted companion. But truth mattered little to the tribunal. She was human, and humans had no place in Krexar space. The sentence, Inquisitor Varek continued, his voice rising to fill every corner of the chamber, is death by the Maul. A collective shiver ran through the assembled crowd. Even among the Krexar, the Maul was spoken of in hushed tones. It was a chamber buried deep beneath the ice continent of Vora, and within it lived their ultimate weapon, Arkhan, the albino mammoth. Arkhan was no ordinary creature. Born in genetic laboratories and sculpted through ancient biotechnology, he was a colossus of engineered rage. Standing 3 times the height of a man, with tusks that could pierce starship hulls and strength that could level buildings, Arkhan had never known anything but violence. The Krexar had fed in criminals, traitors, even rogue warriors, none had ever survived more than moments in his presence. As the sentence echoed through the hall, Alara slowly raised her head. Her chin lifted with quiet dignity, and her pale hazel eyes that seemed to flicker green in the harsh light, met the gaze of her judges. She did not speak, but something in her expression made even the hardened guards uncomfortable. Young soldier Thalen, stationed near the prisoner's platform, found himself stepping back when those eyes fell upon him. It wasn't fear he saw there, or desperation, or even anger. It was something far more unsettling, it was pity. This child, sentenced to the most horrific death their empire could devise, looked upon her captors with compassion. The transport was prepared, its engines humming with ominous purpose. As Alara was led toward her fate, her chains rattling with each step, none of the Krexar realized what they were truly doing. They thought they were sending a helpless child to her death. They had no idea they were about to unleash a storm that would shake their empire to its very foundations. The massive doors of the tribunal chamber sealed shut behind her, and Alara Vance began her journey to the depths of Vora, where ancient ice held secrets that would soon be revealed. Into the Maul. The transport ship descended through the thick atmosphere of Vora, its hull groaning against the fierce winds that swept across the ice continent. Through the reinforced windows, Alara could see nothing but endless white, glaciers that stretched beyond the horizon, carved by millennia of storms into jagged peaks and deep crevasses. The Maul facility emerged from the ice like a metallic tumor, its dark surfaces absorbing the pale light of Vora's twin suns. Massive excavation equipment surrounded the complex, testament to the incredible effort required to carve this prison from the living glacier. Steam rose from thermal vents, creating ghostly wisps that danced in the frigid air. Alara was transferred to a smaller vehicle that descended through a vertical shaft cut directly into the ice. The walls blurred past, revealing layers of frozen history, ancient sediment, trapped air bubbles, and occasionally, the dark silhouette of some long-extinct creature preserved in the perpetual cold. The journey down seemed to last forever, but finally, the transport shuddered to a halt. Through the speakers, a mechanical voice announced, "Maul level reached. Prisoner transfer initiated." The guards who escorted her seemed nervous, their scaled hands trembling slightly as they checked their weapons. Even among the Krexar, assignment to the Maul was considered a punishment. The facility had a reputation for breaking minds as well as bodies. They led her through corridors carved from solid ice, their footsteps echoing in the frozen silence. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly green glow, and the air was so cold that each breath sent clouds of vapor streaming from their nostrils. Finally, they reached the chamber's entrance, a massive circular door made of reinforced metal, covered in warning symbols in dozens of languages. The guards activated the opening sequence, and the door spiraled open with a sound like breaking glass. Beyond lay a reinforced chute that dropped into darkness. "This is where you get off, human," one of the guards growled, his voice distorted by his breathing apparatus. Alara looked down into the abyss below. Somewhere in that darkness waited Arkhan, the creature that had never met an opponent he couldn't destroy. She felt the eyes of the guards upon her, waiting for her to beg, to plead, to show the fear they expected. Instead, she stepped forward willingly. "Wait," called one of the younger guards, his voice uncertain. "Shouldn't we?" "Orders are orders," his superior snapped. "The human goes down alone." The chute hissed open with a decompression sigh that echoed through the chamber. Alara fell for what felt like an eternity, the walls of the shaft rushing past her in a blur of ice and metal. 3 seconds later, she hit the ground hard, rolling twice before coming to rest on the frozen floor. The chamber around her was massive, at least 200 meters across, carved from a natural cavern in the glacier. The walls curved upward like the inside of a massive egg, and embedded throughout were surveillance cameras that glowed with soft red light. Ancient tusks from previous victims lined the outer walls, some carved with forgotten languages, others stained black with age and blood. Alara pushed herself up slowly, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The floor beneath her was smooth carbonite, polished to a mirror shine by decades of use. Dark stains marked its surface, the only remaining evidence of those who had come before her. A deep silence hung in the air, oppressive and waiting. Then, from the far end of the cavern, came a sound that made the very walls tremble, a low, thunderous exhale that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. Snow drifted down from the ceiling, dislodged by the vibration. The ground beneath her feet shuddered once, like a world remembering its own heartbeat. And then Arkhan stepped into view. The albino mammoth was even more massive than the stories had suggested. His fur was white as fresh snow, though streaked with pink scars from countless battles. His legs were like columns of living stone, each step sending tremors through the frozen ground. His tusks curved upward like twin spears, their tips stained dark with the blood of previous victims. But it was his eyes that held Alara's attention, pale blue orbs that seemed to hold the cold of entire glaciers, ancient and filled with a terrible intelligence. Arkhan's breath steamed in thick columns that rose toward the ceiling like vaporized dreams. His massive head turned toward her, and those planet-like eyes locked onto her small form. For a moment that stretched into eternity, girl and beast regarded each other across the frozen chamber. Above them, in the observation deck, the Krexar officials leaned forward in anticipation, waiting for the inevitable slaughter. But Alara did not scream. She did not run. Instead, she took one small step forward, her bare feet pressing into the ice, and met Arkhan's gaze as if she were staring down a storm. The mammoth froze, his massive form going completely still. Something impossible was happening, something that had never occurred in the history of the Maul. For the first time in his existence, Arkhan hesitated. The impossible bond. In the observation deck high above the Maul, Commander Dravik and his fellow officials pressed against the reinforced viewing glass, their elongated necks craned forward in disbelief. What they were witnessing defied every piece of data they had on Arkhan, every biological model, every psychological profile. The albino mammoth stood motionless in the center of the chamber, his massive form trembling slightly as if caught between conflicting impulses. His head was lowered toward the small human girl, and his breathing had changed from the aggressive snorts they knew so well to something softer, more thoughtful. "Impossible," whispered Dravik, his scaled fingers leaving marks on the observation window. "Deploy the neural stimulators. Activate his rage protocols." A technician's hands flew over the control console, but the screens flashed red with error messages. "Commander, the biolinks are offline. The system says they've been disconnected." "By whom?" Dravik's voice rose to a hiss. I don't know, sir. The disconnection appears to be voluntary. As if Arkhan chose to sever the connections himself. Down in the Maul, Alara took another step forward. Her voice, clear and gentle, echoed strangely against the curved walls of the chamber. "You're tired," she said, her words carrying a weight far beyond her years. "You've been screaming alone for too long." Arkhan's breath caught, a sound like wind through distant caves. His massive eye blinked slowly, thick lashes shuddering in the frigid air. Never in his existence had anyone spoken to him with such understanding, such absence of fear. Alara took 2 more steps, closing the distance between them until she stood directly before the creature that had destroyed hundreds of opponents. Slowly, carefully, she raised her small hand and placed it against the scarred front of his trunk. The moment her palm made contact with his fur, something ancient and profound moved through the chamber. Arkhan, breaker of warriors, bane of criminals, the Krexar Empire's ultimate weapon of destruction, lowered himself to one knee before a child. The observation deck erupted into chaos. Alarms began blaring as officials shouted conflicting orders. Emergency protocols activated, bathing the chamber in pulsing red light. But down below, Alara simply walked forward and sat beneath Arkhan's massive chin, crossing her legs and leaning against the warmth of his body as if she had always belonged there. "You didn't want to hurt them," she whispered, her fingers running through the coarse white fur near his jaw. She traced a particularly deep scar with her thumb, her eyes distant with understanding. "You were made to fight, but you never chose it. You screamed and no one heard." The mammoth's eye closed slowly, and for the first time in his existence, Arkhan made a sound that wasn't born of rage or pain. It was a sigh, deep, drawn from the very depths of his being, carrying with it years of suppressed sorrow and longing. "I know what that feels like," Alara continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Being trapped, being forced to be something you're not. But we don't have to be what they made us to be." Above them, the surveillance cameras flickered and died one by one. Not from sabotage or system failure, but from something far more unprecedented. The AI systems that controlled them were refusing to record what they recognized as a moment too pure for the eyes of the Empire. Commander Dravik pounded his fist against the dead monitors. "Get me visual. Deploy ground teams. I want that chamber flooded with stun weapons." But even as he gave the orders, he knew something fundamental had changed. The readings from Arkhan's biomonitors, when they'd been working, had shown something impossible. The creature's stress levels had dropped to 0. His heart rate had normalized. For the first time since his creation, Arkhan was at peace. In the chamber below, Alara looked up at the darkened cameras and smiled. It was a gentle expression, filled with the wisdom of someone who had seen beyond the surface of things to the truth beneath. "They're scared now," she told Arkhan, her hand still resting against his trunk. "They don't understand that the strongest thing in the universe isn't violence. It's choosing not to use it when you could." Arkhan's response was to shift his massive bulk slightly, creating a more comfortable shelter for the girl who had given him something he'd never known he was missing, the simple gift of being seen for who he truly was, rather than what he'd been designed to become. And in that moment, both prisoners of the Krexar Empire began to plan their escape. Not through violence or destruction, but through something far more powerful, the unbreakable bond between two souls who had found understanding in the most unlikely of places. The ice did not shatter, but the myth certainly did. The Great Escape. Hours passed in the frozen chamber, though time seemed meaningless in the perpetual twilight of the Maul. Alara remained curled against Arkhan's warm bulk, both of them resting in a peace neither had known before. But they both understood that this sanctuary was temporary. The Krexar would not allow this impossible situation to continue indefinitely. The first sign of their response came as a distant rumbling through the ice. Emergency teams were mobilizing, heavy equipment being moved into position. The Empire had invested too much in their ultimate weapon to let a human child render it useless. "They're coming," Alara whispered, though she made no move to distance herself from her massive companion. Arkhan lifted his great head, his ears swiveling to catch sounds that human hearing couldn't detect. Through the complex acoustic tunnels of the facility, he could hear the approach of armed guards, the whine of energy weapons charging, the mechanical clank of restraint devices. For a moment, his old programming flickered to life, the genetic imperative to fight, to destroy, to rage against anything that threatened him. But then he felt the small hand still resting against his fur, and the violence faded as quickly as it had risen. "There," Alara said, pointing toward a section of the chamber wall where thermal vents created a network of passages through the ice. "The maintenance tunnels. They lead to the upper levels." Arkhan's massive eye followed her gesture, and he understood immediately. His creators had never considered that he might one day want to leave this place. The passages were too small for his bulk, designed only for automated systems and emergency access. But they hadn't accounted for his strength. Rising to his full height, Arkhan approached the wall with careful deliberation. His tusks, honed by countless battles, pressed against the ice at precise points of structural weakness. With controlled pressure, nothing like the wild fury he'd been programmed to display, he began to widen the passages. The ice groaned and cracked, but held. Ancient permafrost, harder than steel, required more than brute force. Arkhan stepped back, considering the problem with an intelligence that his handlers had never bothered to acknowledge. "Together," Alara said softly, moving to stand beside him. She placed her hands against the ice, and closed her eyes. What happened next would have been impossible to explain to the Krexar scientists who had created their perfect weapon. The bioelectrical field that had allowed Alara to interface with their starship systems, to communicate with their AI, to tame creatures that should have been untamable, now flowed through the ancient ice. The frozen wall began to resonate, its molecular structure shifting subtly. Stress fractures appeared along the lines where Arkhan's tusks had marked the surface. The ice didn't shatter, it simply gave way, like a door recognizing the rightful owner's key. Together, they carved a path through the glacier itself. Behind them, the main entrance to the Maul exploded inward as Krexar shock troops poured into the chamber. Energy weapons lit up the space with deadly coherent light, seeking targets that were no longer there. The thermal tunnels. Commander Dravik's voice echoed through the comms. "Seal the facility. Deploy hunters to every exit." But Alara and Arkhan were already moving through passages that transformed around them, the ancient ice reshaping itself to accommodate the mammoth's massive frame. What should have been a deadly maze became a highway, leading ever upward toward the surface. They emerged into the main corridors of the facility just as the lockdown alarms began to wail. Krexar personnel fled before them, not from Arkhan's presence, for he moved with calm purpose rather than rage, but from the impossibility of what they were witnessing. A human child and their ultimate weapon, walking side by side through the halls of their most secure installation. Emergency blast doors slammed shut across their path, each one rated to withstand starship weapons. Arkhan approached them without hesitation, but instead of ramming them with his tusks, he simply placed his trunk against the metal and pushed. Slowly, inexorably, the doors groaned open, not from violence, but from the application of carefully controlled strength. "How is this possible?" one technician whispered as they passed. "He's showing more intelligence than our computers predicted he possessed." "That's because they never let him think for himself," Alara replied, her voice carrying clearly through the corridor. "They only saw what they wanted to see." They reached the main elevator shaft that connected the Maul to the surface levels. The elevator itself had been locked down, its cars secured at the upper levels to prevent any possibility of escape. But the shaft remained, a vertical tunnel through hundreds of meters of ice and metal. Arkhan studied the challenge for a moment, then positioned himself carefully in the center of the shaft. His legs spread wide for stability, his tusks braced against the walls, he began to climb. Each movement was calculated, controlled, using the natural ridges and support structures as handholds designed for a creature far smaller than himself. Alara rode on his back, her small hands gripping his fur as they ascended through what should have been an impossible route. With each level they passed, the pursuit grew more frantic behind them. But they also drew closer to something the Krexar had never imagined their prisoners might reach, the surface of Vora, and the possibility of true freedom. Almost there, Alara whispered as the first hint of natural light filtered down through the shaft above them. Just a little further. Arkhan rumbled his agreement, a sound of determination rather than aggression. For the first time in his existence, he was moving towards something he wanted rather than being driven by programming he couldn't control. They were going to make it. Against all odds, against every safeguard the Empire had created, a child and a creature were about to do the impossible, escape from the most secure prison in Krexar space. But their greatest challenge still lay ahead, waiting for them in the frozen wasteland above. Freedom's light. The surface of Vora stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of white beneath an alien sky painted with the aurora of twin suns. The wind howled across the ice plains, carrying crystals that stung like microscopic daggers. It was a landscape that had never known mercy, where even the hardiest Krexar required environmental suits to survive. But Alara felt none of the cold as she sat atop Arkhan's broad back, his thick fur providing shelter from the worst of the wind. The mammoth moved with surprising grace across the frozen terrain, his massive feet finding purchase on surfaces that would have sent vehicles sliding into crevasses. Behind them, the Maul facility was in complete chaos. Emergency lights strobed through the ice, and the sound of pursuit craft filled the air. But the Krexar forces were learning what Alara had already discovered: their perfect weapon was far more intelligent than they had ever imagined. Arkhan chose routes that the aircraft couldn't follow, leading them through ice caverns and around thermal vents that scrambled their sensors. When pursuit vehicles did manage to corner them, he didn't fight. Instead, he would wait patiently as Alara placed her hands on their communication systems, causing them to receive conflicting orders that sent them racing off in wrong directions. There, Alara said, pointing toward a distant mountain range where the ice gave way to exposed rock. The old mining stations. They'll have communication equipment we can use. The abandoned outposts had been built during the early days of Krexar expansion on Vora, when they still believed the planet held valuable mineral deposits. Now they stood empty, their automated systems still functional but forgotten by the Empire's bureaucracy. As they approached the nearest station, Arkhan slowed to a gentle stop. The structure was built into the mountainside, its entrance sealed by heavy doors that had been locked for decades. But locks meant nothing to creatures who had already escaped from the most secure prison in the galaxy. The station's interior was a maze of corridors and chambers carved from living rock. Emergency lighting flickered to life as they passed, triggered by ancient motion sensors. Alara made her way to what had once been the communication center, its equipment old but still functional. Her fingers danced across the control panels with the same instinctive knowledge that had allowed her to interface with Krexar technology. Within minutes, she had established a connection that bypassed the Empire's monitoring systems entirely. The response came within hours, a rescue ship from the independent worlds, guided by coordinates that Alara transmitted in a coded message only her people would understand. The ship's captain was a grizzled veteran of the border conflicts, used to dangerous rescues, but even he hesitated when he saw what was waiting for him on the landing platform. "Is that," he began, staring at Arkhan through the ship's viewport. "His name is Arkhan," Alara said calmly as she walked up the boarding ramp. "He's coming with us." The mammoth followed without hesitation, his massive form somehow fitting through doorways that should have been far too small. Later, the crew would puzzle over how the ship's corridors seemed to expand to accommodate him, but in that moment they were too focused on the miracle of escape to question the impossible. As their ship lifted off from Vora's surface, Alara stood at one of the observation windows, watching the ice world fall away beneath them. Arkhan stood beside her, his great head lowered to look through the transparent metal at the planet that had been both their prison and the place where they had found each other. No more cages, Alara whispered, her hand resting against his trunk. For either of us. The response came as a gentle rumble of agreement, a sound of contentment that no Krexar had ever heard from their ultimate weapon. Word of their escape spread quickly through the galaxy. The story of a human child who had tamed the Empire's most feared creature became legend among the free worlds. Some said it was impossible, that the reports had been exaggerated. But those who met Alara and Arkhan in the years that followed knew the truth. They settled on a world of rolling plains and gentle rivers, where Arkhan could run freely under open skies. Alara grew up in his shadow, learning from his ancient wisdom while sharing her own gifts of understanding. Together, they became symbols of something the galaxy had almost forgotten, that connection and compassion were stronger than any weapon the Empire could devise. The Krexar never stopped hunting for them, but they had learned something their prey had known all along: true strength came not from violence, but from the bonds forged between beings who saw beyond the surface to the soul beneath. And in the end, that was a power no empire could capture, no cage could contain, and no weapon could destroy. Alara and Arkhan had found something more precious than freedom. They had found each other, and in doing so, had proven that even the darkest prison could not hold two hearts that refused to be broken. Years later, when travelers would ask Alara about her time in the Maul, she would smile and place her hand on Arkhan's trunk, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. "We weren't trapped," she would say. "We were just waiting for the right moment to choose our own path." And in the warmth of the alien sun, surrounded by the endless possibilities of a galaxy where anything was possible for those brave enough to believe in it, they had found their path indeed. The end.